The day they threw us out, my 6-month-old daughter Sarah was running a fever of 102 degrees. I stood in the driveway holding her burning little body against my chest, while my husband Marcus loaded our belongings into trash bags. The fever made her whimper in that heartbreaking way babies do when they can't tell you what's wrong. Margaret Chen, my mother-in-law, watched from her pristine front porch with arms crossed, her face carved from stone. 23 years I'd known this woman. 23 years of family dinners, birthday parties, and holidays where I'd smiled and nodded while she made her little comments about my cooking, my career choices, my parenting. But standing there that October morning with my sick baby and a husband who couldn't even look his own mother in the eye, I saw her clearly for the first time. This wasn't grief making her cruel. This was who she'd always been underneath the designer sweaters and charity luncheons. Her husband Robert stood beside her, fidgeting with his watch the way he always did when he was uncomfortable but wasn't brave enough to speak up. 23 years of him being the silent witness to his wife's calculated cruelty. "You have until noon," Margaret called out, her voice cutting through the morning air like glass. "The locks change at 12:15. Noon. It was already 10:30. We'd lived in the guest house behind their mansion for 8 months. 8 months while Marcus recovered from his accident, while we struggled with medical bills that ate through our savings like acid. The guest house had been Margaret's idea, her generous offer when our own apartment became impossible to afford. Except generosity had strings attached. Invisible threads that Margaret could pull whenever she wanted to watch us dance. The breaking point came 3 days earlier. Sarah had been crying inconsolably for hours, that exhausted wailing that every parent knows but can never quite prepare for. It was 2 in the morning and Marcus was at his overnight security job, leaving me alone with a baby who refused every comfort I offered. The knock on my door was sharp, demanding. I opened it to find Margaret standing there in her silk robe, her face twisted with something darker than mere annoyance. "Control your child," she said, but the way she said it made something cold settle in my chest. "Not our grandchild, not sweet little Sarah, your child." Like Sarah was some stranger's problem that had wandered into her perfect world. "She's teething," I explained, bouncing Sarah gently. "The pediatrician said." "I don't care what the pediatrician said. Robert has an important meeting tomorrow and he needs his sleep. If you can't handle basic parenting, maybe you should consider other arrangements." Other arrangements. The phrase hung between us like a threat. That night, I held Sarah until she finally settled, but I couldn't sleep. Something had shifted in that doorway. Some line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Margaret had shown me exactly how precarious our situation really was. The next morning, I called my sister Elena in Sacramento. "They're going to kick us out," I told her, keeping my voice low even though Margaret and Robert had left for their morning tennis match. "I can feel it coming." Elena was quiet for a long moment. She'd never liked Marcus's family, had warned me years ago about people who used money as a weapon. "Do you remember what Dad always said about paper trails?" she finally asked. Our father had been an accountant, meticulous and careful about documentation. He'd raised us to understand that everything important should be written down, witnessed, recorded. "Paper trails tell the truth when people won't," I recited the familiar phrase. "When Marcus had his accident, when they offered you the guest house, did you sign anything?" I froze. "A rental agreement, month to month." "But Elena, it's Margaret's property, she can." "Send me a copy of everything. Every document, every text message, every email, everything." Something in her tone made my pulse quicken. Elena was a paralegal, had spent 15 years working with housing law and tenant rights. But more than that, she understood the way cruel people operated, the way they left themselves vulnerable when they thought they were untouchable. I spent that day gathering every piece of paper, every digital record of our arrangement with the Chens. The rental agreement that Marcus had signed in the hospital while still groggy from pain medication. The text messages from Margaret about utilities and maintenance. The emails about Sarah's nursery setup. And then I found something else. Something that made my hands shake as I read it. A property deed. Marcus's grandfather's deed specifically. The deed to the very mansion Margaret and Robert lived in so comfortably. Marcus's grandfather, David Chen, had died 4 years ago. He'd left the mansion to Marcus, his only grandson, with one condition. Margaret and Robert could live there until both had passed away, but the property belonged to Marcus. Margaret had never mentioned this, not once in 4 years, not when she'd been gracious enough to let us stay in the guest house on her property. Not when she'd been generous enough to offer us temporary housing during our difficult time. She'd been collecting rent from us for a guest house on property that already belonged to my husband. The rage that filled me wasn't hot and explosive, it was cold, calculated, the kind that settles into your bones and changes how you see the world. Margaret had been playing a game where only she knew all the rules. I photographed everything and sent it to Elena, then spent the night researching, following paper trails through county records and legal databases. By morning, I understood exactly what had happened. David Chen had been a careful man, a man who understood that death brings out the worst in families. His will was ironclad, his intentions crystal clear. The mansion belonged to Marcus, but Margaret had been managing the estate paperwork, had simply forgotten to mention that detail. For 4 years, she'd been living in a house that legally belonged to her son, making decisions about property that wasn't hers to control. When the eviction came, I was ready. 30 days, Elena had told me. California law requires 30 days notice for month-to-month rentals, even if they're family. They can't just throw you out. But Margaret wasn't interested in legal requirements. She was interested in power, in watching us scramble and struggle while she maintained her position of superiority. The sheriff's deputy who showed up at our door that morning was apologetic but firm. He handed Marcus the official eviction notice with genuine sympathy in his eyes. "I'm sorry, folks, I have to ask you to gather your belongings and vacate the premises immediately." Marcus read the notice with shaking hands, his face growing paler with each line. The document claimed we'd violated our rental agreement by disturbing the peace and creating an unsafe environment for all residents of the property. "This is garbage," Marcus whispered, but his voice held no fight. 8 months of feeling like a burden in his mother's house had worn him down to nothing. The deputy escorted us as we packed our few belongings, Margaret watching from her porch like she was enjoying dinner theater. Every few minutes she'd call out another instruction. "Don't forget the baby clothes I bought, those stay here. That high chair was purchased with my money. Leave it." Each demand was a small cruelty, a reminder that she held all the power and we held none. By 11:30, we had our entire life reduced to garbage bags and cardboard boxes. Sarah was crying again, her fever making her limp and miserable in my arms. Marcus loaded our car with mechanical movements, his shoulders curved with defeat. That's when Elena's car pulled into the driveway. She stepped out wearing a sharp gray suit, her paralegal bearing making her look official and dangerous. Behind her came a man I didn't recognize, older, wearing an expensive coat that screamed serious lawyer money. Margaret's expression flickered for just a moment. Uncertainty, maybe concern, but she recovered quickly. "This is private property," she called out. "You need to leave immediately." Elena smiled, and there was something predatory in it. "Mrs. Chen, I'm Elena Rodriguez, representing Marcus and Amy Chen in this eviction matter." Her voice carried across the driveway like a bell. "This is James Morrison, our attorney." The man beside her nodded gravely, his presence somehow making the morning feel heavier, more serious. "There's been a misunderstanding about the legal status of this property," Elena continued, her tone conversational but edged with steel. "We're here to resolve it." Margaret's face went very still. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this is my property, and you're trespassing." Morrison stepped forward, pulling a thick manila folder from his briefcase. "Actually, Mrs. Chen, that's precisely what we're here to discuss." His voice was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes people lean in and listen carefully. "It seems there's been some confusion about the ownership of this property following David Chen's death 4 years ago." The color drained from Margaret's face so quickly, I thought she might faint. "We have copies of the probate records here," Morrison continued, opening his folder with deliberate precision. "David Chen's will explicitly transferred ownership of this property to his grandson, Marcus Chen, with the provision that you and your husband could reside here as long as you both shall live." Robert stepped forward then, his face confused. "That can't be right. Margaret handles all the estate paperwork she never mentioned. The property belongs to Marcus. Morrison interrupted gently. Has belonged to him for 4 years. Which means, Mrs. Chen, you've been collecting rent from your son for a guest house on his own property. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, all her certainty, all her control, evaporating in real time. Furthermore, Morrison continued, his voice gaining strength, the eviction notice you served today is completely invalid. You don't have the legal authority to evict anyone from this property. Elena stepped beside him, her smile sharp as broken glass. But we do. She pulled out another set of documents, these ones crisp and official-looking. Marcus, as the property owner, is hereby serving you notice to vacate the main house within 30 days. You've been living here without a lease agreement, without paying rent to the actual property owner, and you've been mismanaging estate assets. Margaret's legs seemed to give out. She sat down hard on her porch steps, staring at the papers in Elena's hands like they were weapons pointed directly at her heart. The guest house, Morrison added conversationally, will remain occupied by the property owners. That's Marcus, Amy, and their daughter Sarah. I felt something unlock in my chest, some tight knot of fear and humiliation finally loosening. Sarah chose that moment to stop crying, looking around with fever-bright eyes, like she somehow understood that everything had just changed. This is impossible, Margaret whispered, but there was no strength in it. Would you like to see the county records? Elena asked sweetly. The property tax statements that have been filed in Marcus's name for 4 years, the insurance documents, the utility records? Each question landed like a physical blow. Margaret had been so busy wielding power that she'd forgotten to check whether that power was actually hers to wield. Robert looked between his wife and the lawyers, understanding dawning on his face like a sunrise. Margaret, did you know about this, about the will? She couldn't answer, couldn't even look at him. Morrison handed Marcus a set of keys, the original house keys that Margaret had never returned after David's funeral. These are yours, he said simply. They always were. Marcus took the keys with trembling hands, staring at them like he couldn't quite believe they were real. But Elena wasn't finished. There's one more thing, she said, pulling out a final document. We've also discovered some irregularities in how the estate has been managed. Margaret's head snapped up, terror flashing in her eyes. It appears that rental income from the guest house has been deposited into accounts that don't belong to the estate. Additionally, property improvements and maintenance have been charged to accounts that should have been the responsibility of the actual property owner. Morrison nodded gravely. Essentially, Mrs. Chen, you've been profiting from property that doesn't belong to you while allowing the actual owner to believe he was indebted to your generosity. The word hung in the air like poison, fraud. We're prepared to pursue both civil and criminal charges, Elena continued, her voice never losing its professional calm. However, our clients are willing to consider alternatives. She let that sink in for a moment, watching Margaret's face cycle through fear, calculation, and desperation. Full restitution of all rental income collected, plus interest. Immediate transfer of all estate management responsibilities to the rightful owner. And a public apology for the emotional distress caused by today's illegal eviction attempt. Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a croak. How much? Morrison consulted his notes with the deliberate pace of a man who knew he held all the cards. Approximately $47,000, plus interest and legal fees. The number hit Margaret like a physical blow. I watched her do the math, watched her realize that her cruelty had cost her nearly $50,000. But more than that, it had cost her the position of power she'd held over her son for years, the ability to make us grateful for crumbs from her table. The satisfaction of watching us struggle while she remained comfortable and secure. I'll need to speak with my attorney, she whispered. Of course. Morrison agreed pleasantly. You have 48 hours to respond. After that, we file the criminal complaint and begin foreclosure proceedings on your outstanding debt to the estate. Foreclosure. The word hit Robert like a bullet. Foreclosure? His voice cracked. This is our home. Elena's smile was cold as winter. Actually, Mr. Chen, this is Marcus and Amy's home. You've been guests for 4 years. Unwelcome guests, as of today. The deputy who'd been waiting patiently through this entire exchange cleared his throat. So, am I still enforcing this eviction, or? Morrison handed him a copy of the property deed. The eviction notice was served by someone without legal authority. It's void. However, if Mrs. Chen attempts to interfere with the rightful owner's occupancy of their property, that would be trespassing. The deputy studied the paperwork, his expression shifting from confusion to professional understanding. Understood, ma'am. He addressed Margaret. I'd advise you to contact your attorney immediately and avoid any further contact with these folks until this gets sorted out legally. Margaret nodded numbly, still staring at Elena's briefcase, like it contained her entire world turned upside down. As the deputy drove away, Morrison handed me a business card. If they give you any trouble at all, call immediately. And I'd suggest changing all the locks on the property, both main house and guest house, today. Elena hugged me carefully, mindful of Sarah still in my arms. Dad would be proud, she whispered. Paper trails really do tell the truth. As their car pulled away, I looked back at Margaret and Robert still frozen on their porch. 23 years of marriage to their son, and they'd finally shown me who they really were. But more importantly, I'd shown them who I really was. We didn't move our things back immediately. Instead, Marcus and I sat on our front steps, on our property, and watched the afternoon shadows lengthen across our land. Sarah's fever had broken. She was alert now, looking around with bright eyes like she was seeing everything fresh. Her first word had been "Dada," just 2 weeks ago. Maybe her second word would be home. I should have known, Marcus said quietly, about grandfather's will. I should have asked questions. I shifted Sarah to one arm and reached for his hand. She made sure you wouldn't ask questions, that was the point. Margaret had been playing a long game, using grief and guilt and exhaustion to keep Marcus from looking too closely at the legal details. She'd counted on his trust, his assumption that family meant safety. What happens now? He asked. Before I could answer, our neighbor from across the street came walking over. Mrs. Patterson was 70, with sharp eyes and opinions she wasn't shy about sharing. Heard some commotion earlier, she said, settling herself on our bottom step like she belonged there. Everything all right? I found myself smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. Everything's perfect, Mrs. Patterson. We're home. That evening, I called Elena to thank her. How did you figure it out so fast? I asked. The will, the property ownership, all of it? Honestly, it was too convenient. Margaret offering you the guest house on her property, being so generous while also being controlling. Generous people don't usually come with that many strings attached. Elena paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Plus, you mentioned that Marcus's grandfather was careful with money. Careful people don't usually leave estate matters unclear, so I started digging. And Morrison? How did you find him so quickly? He's been handling tenant rights cases for 20 years. When I explained the situation, he cleared his schedule immediately. Apparently, he really hates landlords who abuse their power. That night, Marcus and I walked through the main house for the first time in 4 years. Room after room of furniture and memories that should have been ours to visit, to touch, to share with our daughter. Margaret's decorating was everywhere. Expensive vases, professional family photos that somehow managed to exclude Marcus from most of the shots, art that looked impressive but felt cold. We'll need to redecorate, Marcus said, running his fingers along a mantel that held no pictures of our wedding, our first apartment, Sarah's birth. Completely, I agreed. Some battles you win through strength, others through strategy. But the sweetest victories come when the truth finally finds its voice. 2 days later, Margaret's attorney called Morrison. They would pay the full restitution rather than face criminal charges. Margaret and Robert would remain in the house for now, but all estate management would transfer to Marcus immediately. They would sign a formal lease agreement, paying market-rate rent to live in what had once been their son's property. The power had shifted completely. That afternoon, Margaret knocked on our guest house door. She stood there looking smaller somehow, diminished in a way that made me almost feel sorry for her. Almost. I want to apologize, she said, though the words seemed to cost her physical pain. I didn't invite her in. Sarah was napping, and I wasn't about to risk waking her for Margaret's convenience. For which part? I asked. The illegal eviction? The 4 years of stolen rent? Or the 23 years of treating your son like a burden instead of family? Margaret's face flinched with each item on the list. I was trying to protect the estate, she said weakly. David's legacy. David's legacy was making sure his grandson inherited his property. You were trying to protect your own position. We stared at each other across the threshold of my home, my actual, legal, undisputed home. I did love David, she said finally. I do love Marcus. Love shouldn't feel like a loan with impossible interest rates. Margaret had no answer for that. After she left, I found Marcus in the backyard, pushing Sarah on the baby swing we'd bought but never been sure we had the right to install permanently. Mom stopped by, I told him. I know. I saw her leave. He paused the swing gently. How do you feel about them staying in the house? I considered the question seriously. The smart move might have been to evict them immediately, to claim the full mansion for ourselves. But Morrison had advised patience. Let them pay rent for a while, he'd suggested. Let them get used to the new dynamic. You can always change your mind later, but you can't undo hasty decisions. I think I like the symbolism, I said finally. They spent 4 years making us feel like charity cases. Now they get to write us rent checks every month. Marcus smiled, and it was the first real smile I'd seen from him since the accident. Justice? Justice. Sarah laughed, reaching for the clouds with chubby fingers, and for the first time in months, our world felt exactly the right size. The story could have ended there, with Margaret humbled and us vindicated. But real life doesn't wrap up as neatly as stories usually do. 3 months later, Margaret tried to contest the will. Her attorney filed a motion claiming David had been mentally incompetent when he'd written the document that Marcus had exercised undue influence over his grandfather. It was a desperate move, but desperation makes people dangerous. Morrison called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with controlled anger. She's claiming David was suffering from dementia when he signed the will. She's producing medical records that supposedly show cognitive decline. My blood went cold. Can she do that? Can she overturn everything? Not if the records are fabricated, which I suspect they are, but we'll need to prove it. Elena and I spent the next week becoming amateur detectives. We interviewed David's doctors, his neighbors, his friends from the senior center. Every person we spoke to painted the same picture. A sharp, careful man who knew exactly what he was doing right up until his final day. The medical records Margaret's attorney produced told a different story. According to these documents, David had been showing signs of serious cognitive decline for months before his death. But there was a problem with Margaret's evidence. The dates didn't match. Elena noticed it first, squinting at the medical files spread across my kitchen table. These appointments, she said, pointing to a series of entries. They're all on Thursdays. So? David volunteered at the food bank every Thursday for 6 years. I have pictures of him there the week before he died, sharp as ever, organizing inventory. That single discrepancy unraveled Margaret's entire case. Morrison subpoenaed the original medical records, not the copies Margaret had provided. The real files showed a man in good health with normal cognitive function. Someone had altered the documents, creating a false narrative of decline. When confronted with evidence of document tampering, Margaret's attorney withdrew from the case entirely. The judge was not amused. Mrs. Chen, attempting to defraud the court and fabricate evidence is a serious criminal matter. I'm referring this case to the district attorney for investigation. Margaret left the courthouse in handcuffs. That evening, Robert came to our door. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past week. I didn't know, were his first words. About the will, about the forged records, about any of it. Marcus invited him in, and we sat in our living room, the living room that had always belonged to us, but that we'd never been allowed to claim. She told me the house was hers, Robert continued, his voice hollow. When David died, she handled all the paperwork. I trusted her. Trust. Such a small word for such a devastating weapon. What happens now? I asked. Robert looked around the room like he was seeing it for the first time. I don't know. The attorneys are talking about plea deals, restitution, possible prison time. He paused. I might lose the house either way. Marcus leaned forward. Dad, you can stay. We never wanted to throw you out. But things have to change. No more lies, no more manipulation. We're family, but we're also landlord and tenant now. Those boundaries matter. Robert nodded slowly. I think those boundaries might be the healthiest thing for all of us. Margaret took a plea deal that kept her out of prison but required full financial restitution and 2 years of community service. She moved into a modest apartment across town. Her reign over the family estate officially ended. Robert stayed in the main house, paying rent and slowly rebuilding a relationship with his son based on honesty instead of obligation. And us? We finally got to raise our daughter in a home where love didn't come with conditions. Sarah took her first steps in the backyard that had always been hers by right. Her second word wasn't home after all. It was mine. Standing there watching her toddle across grass that belonged to us, I understood something important about justice. It's not about revenge or seeing your enemies suffer. It's about truth finding its place in the world. Margaret had built her power on lies. Lies about who owned what, who owed whom, who deserved what kind of treatment. When the lies crumbled, so did the power. But the truth? The truth about family, about home, about who we really were underneath all the manipulation and control? That truth was foundation strong enough to build a real life on. Elena visits every month now, bringing her own children to play with Sarah in our backyard. Mrs. Patterson has claimed permanent visitation rights to our front steps. Morrison sends holiday cards addressed to the rightful owners. And sometimes, when Sarah's fever spikes or she cries inconsolably in the middle of the night, I remember that morning when Margaret stood on her porch watching us load our life into garbage bags. The woman who told me to control my child, who treated our desperation as an inconvenience, who wielded her power like a blade aimed directly at our hearts. That woman lost everything because she forgot the most important rule of wielding power: make sure it's actually yours to wield. Now when Sarah cries, I comfort her in a house that belongs to us. When she's sick, I care for her with the security of knowing we can't be thrown out for having needs. And when she grows up, she'll never know what it feels like to have love held hostage by someone who thinks kindness is a limited resource. That might be the sweetest justice of all.